great disappointment of your administration, of your time in office? I've heard you talk about it so many times.
Here to give those reflections to it, but to be perfectly honest, I would say that's the area in which I have the greatest disappointment, because for at least 5 years in a row, I proposed to the legislature changes in how we pay for our public schools, and they've done almost nothing. Some tweaks, but no substantial reform. And at the same time, we see the cost of public education going up. When we saw last year a decline in our student population of 1,500 kids and an increase in school employment of 218, that just doesn't work. And more we hear people deciding to move away. You see what's happening with our population, not just the kids, but Art Wolf has reported that he expects within 2 years the total population of Vermont will begin to decline. And I'm sure you hear stories about folks, especially older people, who are deciding to move in retirement to not only Florida, in fact, increasingly not Florida, but the Carolinas or Kentucky or Tennessee. I know people who have. I know some who moved to Georgia and Alabama, where the property taxes are a fraction of what they are here, and they get a whole lot more house for the price.
If I could just follow up on what I think Nancy might have been talking about. You say simultaneously that people are insulated from the cost of rising schools by income sensitivity, but also that the majority of the land that's not at income sensitivity is owned by Vermonters. So those 71% of land owned by Vermonters that's not residential property or not homesteads, those people are not insulated from it. So I guess I see that as a little bit of a contradiction.
Well, I'm not sure how to explain it, except people are voting with their feet. We're seeing the exodus. You heard Ernie Pomerleau at the press conference at the State House a couple of weeks ago. His testimony before the Economic Development Committee earlier in the year, he said he could think of about 3 dozen entrepreneurs who are friends of his who decided to become residents of other places. The people who are creating jobs are deciding to create them elsewhere. And we've got to understand that. We've got to look at the reality. Yes, voters go to school district meetings, and through our system of self-government and democracy, vote school budgets up. They bear some responsibility. But I think the General Assembly, through state tax policy, has some obligation to put on the brakes and design a system that will be more sustainable too.
So do you think it's possible to have a meaningful school consolidation bill that uses a voluntary approach, or does it really need to be mandatory?
I'm skeptical about whether a voluntary approach will work. We have a voluntary approach now, to be honest. School districts are free to present to the Commissioner and Board of Education a merger plan. A few have in recent years, but not many. So that's why I say age 66 is meaningless. We have a voluntary consolidation plan now, and it isn't having a lot of effect.
Well, if you have a mandatory approach, isn't the concern who gets to decide, who ultimately has the power to make these decisions?
I've mentioned to you, I think, the experience in the state of Maine that's gone through this process. My counterpart there explains that it hasn't been pretty, it hasn't been easy, but one key difference is it was embraced by the NEA in Maine, because they recognized the same demographic shift that we're seeing in Vermont, and they realized that it was inevitable. And they, as one Maine resident explained to me, realized that at the end of the day there were going to be either fewer teachers or fewer administrators, and they thought they'd better get on the bandwagon of fewer administrators. And they did, and so the number of school districts in Maine has been cut in about half. There was a referendum last year or earlier this year to reverse it because they have this initiative process, but the voters held firm and said, no, we do want that to go forward. But it's been difficult. But Governor Baldacci believes that it wouldn't have happened without without the state providing that leadership and driving the process forward.
So do you think the Commissioner of Education, I remember when the Challenges plan was unveiled, he had his approach, he was going to be able to have the power to consolidate school districts and have far fewer than we have today. Is that the right approach?
Could be the Commissioner, it could be the Board of Education. There are different structural approaches on how the process might work. Some have suggested a BRAC approach, similar to what was used in military infrastructure realignment. There are different ways to approach it, but I think there has to be some state leadership because although we talk about local control, since Act 60, that's really been diminished. We have a state education fund, we have a statewide property tax. It's all funneled through a state system now, so I think the state, on behalf of taxpayers, has an obligation to make the changes.
But logistically, I mean, what does a post-consolidation school system in Vermont look like? I mean, we're such a small rural state with these tiny populations of kids in widely scattered towns. Are we going to end up with kids having to ride a bus 2 hours to school, or how do you actually organize this so that it can work?
Well, I don't have the answer to that because there are certainly different approaches. The initial step, I think, is a governance consolidation, and then we'll take it one step at a time. The only thing I would say, Dave, is that I look at states like Wyoming, Dakotas, Montana, states with about the same population as Vermont that are much larger geographically and spend less per student. So there's got to be a way. And maybe technology is a part of it. We've talked a little about distance learning. And maybe there are some opportunities there, but we need creativity. We need some ideas. I remember one of my meetings with legislative leaders this year, I said literally, do something. You don't have to take my ideas, but do something.
So why not just veto the bill?
Well, it's nothing bad in it. It just doesn't do anything.
But isn't it bad to say, to enable legislators to go out there and say, hey, we've done something about this? They don't have to address it. I mean, from that viewpoint, they don't have to address it now for a few years. They don't have to worry about it. So
well,
the pressure's off.
Well, I hope that voters won't let the pressure off on them. But I don't think my responsibility is to make a judgment on perception or how things might be handled politically. I think I need to look at the legislation and decide whether it's in the state's best interest or not, and pick my fights.
Well, what's your guess about what the statewide property tax does next year?
Well, without any action, what's our current estimate? 12?
It could be as much as 10 cents.
How much is a dime up? It's a lot. Well, 12%, basically. It's hefty.
So is the bottom line on the school consolidation, Vermont just has too many schools. Some of these small schools have got to go. Is that?
We have the lowest student-teacher ratio in America, and I think as a number of districts have decided, it's just not sustainable. We've seen Granby close a school, we've seen Belvedere close a school over the last few years. Bennington consolidated some schools in its town. I think it's a very likely outcome as our population of students continues to decline. I think the first step is some consolidation of the governance structure, and hope at least we might do that.